There are stories that haunt people because of what we know. Then there are stories that refuse to let go because of what we may never know. Imagine standing outside your family home on Christmas Eve, watching flames swallow every room while five of your children are trapped somewhere inside. You scream their names until your voice gives out. You search for any way to reach them, but every second slips away faster than the last. By sunrise, your neighbors believe they witnessed an unimaginable tragedy. The authorities arrive believing they already know what happened. The newspapers print the story, the community mourns, everyone assumes the case is over. But what if that wasn't the end of the story? What if the greatest mystery didn't begin with the fire itself, but with what investigators failed to find after the flames were finally extinguished? That single question would transform one family's grief into a search for answers that lasted the rest of their lives, raising doubts that continue to divide researchers, journalists, and historians nearly 80 years later. On Christmas Eve in 1945, a family living in the quiet hills of West Virginia prepared for what should have been another joyful holiday together. Before dawn, their home was reduced to ashes, and five of their children were believed to have died in the blaze. Yet as investigators examined what remained of the house, one discovery, or rather, the absence of one, changed everything. The physical evidence many expected to recover was never clearly identified in a way that satisfied the parents, and from that moment forward, they refused to believe the official explanation told the entire story. Over the decades, new claims surfaced, witnesses came forward, mysterious letters arrived, and photographs appeared that seemed to offer hope while raising even more questions. Some investigators argued the original conclusion remained the most likely explanation. Others acknowledged that certain unanswered questions continued to fuel public fascination. Even today, the case remains one of America's most debated historical mysteries because important pieces of the puzzle have never been resolved beyond doubt. Tonight, we're going to carefully examine every major clue, every reported contradiction, and every significant theory connected to this extraordinary case. We won't assume guilt where none was proven, and we won't present speculation as established fact. Instead, we'll follow the evidence as it unfolded over 4 decades, separating documented events from family beliefs, witness recollections, and later interpretations. Along the way, you'll hear about strange events reported before the fire, decisions made during the frantic rescue attempts, discoveries that puzzled investigators, and clues that convinced two grieving parents they should never stop searching for their children. Some of those clues appear compelling at first glance. Others become more complicated the closer you examine them. That is exactly why this story continues to fascinate people across generations. It isn't simply about a devastating fire. It's about the difficult line between evidence and hope, between official conclusions and unanswered questions, and about how far a family will go when they believe the people they loved may still be waiting to be found. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what happened before that Christmas Eve fire may prove to be every bit as important as what happened after the flames disappeared. The events leading up to that night would later take on an entirely different meaning, and when investigators, reporters, and the family began placing those moments together like pieces of a puzzle, they discovered that what first looked like a heartbreaking accident had become one of the most enduring mysteries in American history. The closer we look, the more difficult it becomes to answer a question that should have been settled decades ago. Did five children truly lose their lives in the fire, or did the real story begin long before the first spark ever appeared? By the morning after Christmas Eve, the official story appeared painfully straightforward. A fire had destroyed a family home in Fayetteville, West Virginia, and five children were believed to have lost their lives inside. For the local community, the tragedy was almost too heartbreaking to comprehend. Friends gathered to comfort the surviving members of the family, neighbors tried to make sense of what had happened, and newspapers reported what seemed to be another devastating house fire. Cases like this, while uncommon, were not unheard of in the 1940s, especially in rural communities where emergency response times could be slow and homes were often built almost entirely of wood. Yet for George and Jennie Sodder, something about that explanation never felt complete. Their grief was immediate and overwhelming, but so were the questions that began forming almost as soon as the flames were extinguished. They believed the official account answered the obvious question of how the house was destroyed, but it left several others that no one seemed prepared to explain. Those unanswered questions would become the foundation of one of America's most enduring mysteries. George and Jennie had built a life centered on hard work and family. Together, they were raising 10 children in a close-knit household where Christmas was one of the most anticipated times of the year. Like countless American families, they spent the evening exchanging gifts, enjoying one another's company, and looking forward to Christmas morning. By every outward appearance, it was an ordinary holiday filled with familiar routines and simple traditions. Yet by dawn, that ordinary evening had become the dividing line between two very different versions of the same story. One version, accepted by investigators, concluded that 5 children had tragically died in the fire. The other, held firmly by George and Jennie for the rest of their lives, suggested the children might never have been inside the burning house when it collapsed. Between those two possibilities lies a case filled with conflicting accounts, disputed evidence, fading memories, and questions that have resisted clear answers for nearly 8 decades. The mystery begins with 5 questions that continue to challenge anyone who studies this case. Why were only 5 of the 10 children reported missing while the others escaped? Why did the search of the fire scene fail to produce findings that convinced George and Jennie their children had truly perished there? Why did the family later recall a series of unusual incidents in the days and weeks before the fire? Incidents they believed carried new significance after the tragedy. Were investigators simply working with the best information available under difficult circumstances, or did important details receive less attention than they deserved? And perhaps the most difficult question of all, were George and Jennie uncovering genuine inconsistencies that pointed toward another explanation, or were they trying to make sense of an unimaginable loss through clues that, taken individually, might have had ordinary explanations? These questions remain at the heart of the case because none of them has ever been answered in a way that satisfies everyone who has examined the evidence. Understand why George and Jennie refused to accept the official explanation. We first need to understand the family itself. We need to go back before the fire, before the headlines, before the investigations and decades of speculation, to a time when the Sodder home was simply a place filled with children, laughter, holiday excitement, and plans for the future. Because as we'll soon discover, everything seemed ordinary until a series of small events began to feel anything but ordinary. To understand why George and Jennie Sodder spent the rest of their lives questioning what happened on Christmas Eve, we first have to understand who they were before tragedy became part of their story. George wasn't born in the hills of West Virginia. He came to the United States as a young immigrant from Italy, chasing the same promise that had drawn millions before him, the opportunity to build a better life through determination and hard work. Over the years, he transformed that dream into reality. By the mid-1940s, George had established a successful trucking business, earning a reputation throughout Fayetteville as someone who worked tirelessly to provide for his family. Friends and neighbors knew him as outspoken, confident, and fiercely devoted to the people he loved. Jennie was the steady heart of the household, balancing the endless responsibilities that came with raising 10 children together. They created a home filled with activity where every day brought noise, laughter, disagreements, celebrations, and the ordinary chaos familiar to any large American family. Their home wasn't extravagant, but it was full of warmth, and for George and Jennie, that mattered far more than anything money could buy. Christmas was always one of the happiest times of the year inside the Sodder home. Like countless families across America, they embraced traditions that made the season feel special. Decorations filled the house. The children eagerly counted down the days until Christmas morning, wondering what gifts might be waiting beneath the tree. Jennie prepared food for the family while George enjoyed watching the excitement build among the children as bedtime approached. Older brothers and sisters teased the younger ones, wrapping presents, telling stories, and stretching the holiday festivities as long as possible before everyone finally settled in for the night. Outside, the quiet streets of Fayetteville reflected the peaceful rhythm of a small Appalachian town. Most people knew their neighbors, local businesses closed early for the holiday, and Christmas Eve was usually a time for church services, family gatherings, and peaceful celebrations. Nothing about that evening suggested the community would soon become the center of one of the most debated mysteries in American history. Looking back decades later, survivors would remember it as a night that felt wonderfully ordinary, the kind of memory made even more painful because of everything that followed. Yet when George later reflected on the weeks leading up to the fire, several encounters that once seemed insignificant began to stand out in his mind. According to later interviews and family accounts, one visitor reportedly came to the house asking unusual questions about the property and specifically mentioning the location of the home's fuse boxes. At the time, George dismissed the conversation as odd but harmless. Another reported encounter involved someone making comments about the family's home that George would later remember with growing unease after the fire. These accounts have been repeated over the years in books, newspaper articles, and documentaries covering the case. However, it is important to note that many of these recollections were shared after the tragedy, and investigators have never been able to conclusively verify every detail or establish whether the encounters had any connection to what happened. That uncertainty has become one of the defining features of this mystery. Were these simply isolated incidents that took on greater meaning through hindsight, or were they early pieces of a puzzle that no one recognized until it was too late? Decades later, no definitive answer has emerged, leaving historians and researchers to weigh the reliability of memories formed under extraordinary emotional circumstances. As Christmas Eve continued, nothing appeared out of place inside the Sodder home. The younger children admired their new toys, laughter echoed through the rooms, and the excitement of Christmas morning lingered in the air. Outside, winter had settled over the mountains, and the peaceful darkness wrapped itself around the quiet neighborhood. George and Jennie had every reason to believe they would wake to another joyful holiday surrounded by all 10 of their children. It was the kind of evening millions of American families have experienced, where ordinary moments pass unnoticed because no one imagines they could be the last. But history has a way of changing everything in a matter of minutes. Late that night, after most of the family had gone to bed, the silence inside the house was interrupted by the sharp ring of the telephone. Jennie answered, expecting perhaps a relative calling with Christmas wishes. Instead, a woman's voice asked for someone she didn't recognize. In the background, Jennie later recalled hearing laughter and the sound of glasses clinking, as though a celebration was taking place somewhere else. She politely explained that the caller had reached the wrong number, then hung up and returned to bed, thinking little of the strange conversation. Hours later, that brief phone call would become one more detail examined again and again by a family searching desperately for answers. Before the sun rose over Fayetteville, everything George and Jennie had spent a lifetime building would be changed forever. It was now late on Christmas Eve, December 24, 1945. Inside the Sodder home, the excitement of the holiday had finally begun to fade. Around 11:00 p.m., George and Jennie encouraged the younger children to get ready for bed. Some of the older children wanted to stay awake a little longer, still enjoying their new toys and the excitement that always came with Christmas Eve. Jennie allowed a few of them to remain downstairs for a while before heading upstairs herself. Like parents everywhere, she expected the house to grow quiet within the next hour. There was no sign that anything unusual was about to happen. Outside, Fayetteville was peaceful. Most homes had gone dark, the roads were nearly empty, and the cold mountain air settled over the community. Inside the Sodder home, everyone believed Christmas morning would begin just a few hours later with laughter, breakfast, and children rushing to open more presents. No one knew they were living through the final ordinary moments they would ever share together. Around 12:30 a.m., Jennie suddenly woke. At first, she wasn't sure why. The house seemed unusually quiet, but then she noticed something that caught her attention. Several lights downstairs were still on and the front door had been left unlocked. Assuming one of the children had simply forgotten to turn everything off before going to bed, she walked through part of the house, switched off the lights she saw, checked that the door was secure, and noticed one of her daughters asleep on the living room couch. Nothing immediately suggested danger. Satisfied that everything was in order, Jennie returned upstairs and went back to sleep. Looking back years later, she would remember that moment with heartbreaking clarity. It was the last time the house felt completely normal. Within minutes, the peaceful silence of Christmas morning would be replaced by panic. Not long afterward, Jennie awoke again. This time it wasn't because of a light or an open door. She smelled smoke. Almost immediately, she realized something was terribly wrong. Flames were already visible, spreading through part of the house with alarming speed. She shouted for George, who woke instantly and rushed to see where the fire had started. Within seconds, the couple's only concern became getting their children out alive. They called their children's names as smoke filled the hallways. George and Jennie, along with several of the children, managed to escape outside. In the confusion, however, they realized 5 of their children were still believed to be upstairs. Standing in the freezing darkness, George could see flames racing through the upper portion of the house. He screamed their names again and again, hoping to hear a response. Every passing second made the situation more desperate. George refused to accept that there was nothing he could do. According to later accounts, his first instinct was to rush back into the burning house, but the fire and heavy smoke quickly forced him back. Desperate for another way to reach the upstairs bedrooms, he remembered a ladder that he normally kept beside the house. He ran to the spot where it was usually stored, expecting to grab it and climb to the windows, but the ladder wasn't there. Whether it had been moved earlier for an ordinary reason, or for some other explanation has never been conclusively established, but at that moment George couldn't find it anywhere. Every second spent searching felt like an eternity. Unable to reach the upstairs windows, he turned to another plan. He decided to use one of his heavy trucks, parking it beneath the house so he could climb onto the roof and reach the children from above. It was a solution that had worked before for routine repairs. But when he climbed into the first truck and tried to start the engine, nothing happened. He rushed to another truck. That engine also failed to start. Family members later found this deeply puzzling because, according to George, both vehicles had been operating normally the previous day. Others have suggested the extreme cold or mechanical issues may have contributed. Whatever the reason, George was left watching precious minutes disappear with no way to reach the second floor. At nearly the same time, another obstacle emerged. The family attempted to call the fire department, only to discover the telephone wasn't working. With no direct way to report the emergency, neighbors who noticed the growing flames ran to alert authorities themselves. In rural West Virginia during the 1940s, this process took valuable time. Meanwhile, the fire continued to spread with astonishing speed, consuming room after room until much of the house was engulfed. Neighbors gathered outside, powerless to help as George repeatedly searched for another way inside. They could hear the roar of the flames, see the roof beginning to weaken, and watch the structure collapsing before their eyes. Some later recalled the overwhelming feeling of helplessness as they stood only yards away from a family fighting against time. By the time firefighters finally arrived, the house had already been reduced to a smoldering ruin. There was little left to save. As daylight slowly broke over Fayetteville on Christmas morning, the nightmare entered a new chapter. The fire was finally out, but the questions were only beginning. Investigators walked carefully through the ashes, examining what remained of the Sodder home and searching for evidence that would explain exactly what had happened during those terrifying hours. They expected to confirm the tragic conclusion everyone feared. Instead, the search would uncover an absence that George and Jennie believed changed the entire case. What investigators did not find inside those ashes would become almost as controversial as the fire itself, setting the stage for a mystery that continues to challenge researchers and divide opinion nearly 80 years later. As the smoke drifted away from the ruins of the Sodder home, investigators began the difficult task of determining exactly what had happened during the early hours of Christmas morning. From the very beginning, local authorities believed the evidence pointed toward a tragic but straightforward conclusion. The fire had spread with extraordinary speed through a wooden home during an era when firefighting resources in rural communities were limited. Several members of the family had escaped, while 5 children were believed to have remained upstairs. Given the intensity of the blaze and the complete collapse of the structure, investigators concluded that the children had most likely perished in the fire. An official death determination followed, allowing the case to move toward what authorities considered its conclusion. To many people in Fayetteville, there was little reason to question that assessment. House fires in the 1940s could be devastating, especially when emergency crews arrived after a building had already collapsed. From the investigators' perspective, the tragedy, however heartbreaking, appeared to have a logical explanation. But for George and Jennie Sodder, accepting that conclusion required answers they believed they had never received. The first point of disagreement centered on what was, or found in the ashes. George and Jennie expected that if 5 of their children had died inside the house, investigators would recover physical evidence confirming their deaths. According to the family, no clearly identifiable human remains were presented to them in a way that convinced them their children had actually died there. This became the foundation of their lifelong search for another explanation. Over the years, they repeatedly argued that the absence of confirmed remains made the official conclusion difficult for them to accept. However, fire investigators and forensic experts have offered a different perspective. Modern fire science, along with historical reviews of older investigations, suggests that recovery efforts in the 1940s were often far less systematic than they are today. Extremely intense fires, structural collapse, the condition of the debris, and the forensic techniques available at the time could all complicate the identification of human remains. Some experts believe the family's expectations, while understandable, may not have reflected the realities of fire investigations during that era. Others acknowledge that questions surrounding the search left enough uncertainty to keep the debate alive. Nearly 80 years later, this remains one of the central disagreements in the case. Was important evidence overlooked, or did the limitations of the time make certainty impossible? Another detail soon attracted attention. When the family tried to call for help that night, the telephone wasn't working. For years, many people assumed the fire itself had destroyed the phone line before anyone could make an emergency call. But later examinations suggested something more complicated. Reports indicated that the telephone line had not simply burned through in the fire. According to later accounts, it appeared to have been physically damaged before the flames spread through the house. If those reports were accurate, they raised another question. Was the damage accidental, perhaps caused by falling equipment or another unrelated event, or had someone deliberately interfered with the line before the fire began? Investigators considered various possibilities, and while some later accounts supported the idea that the wire had been cut or pulled down, no definitive evidence ever established who was responsible or exactly when the damage occurred. As with many details in this case, the lack of a conclusive answer allowed competing interpretations to develop, each depending on how individual pieces of evidence were viewed. George also couldn't stop thinking about the ladder. During the desperate moments of the fire, he had run to the place where he always kept it, only to discover it wasn't there. Days later, according to the family's account, the ladder was found some distance away from its usual location. To George, this discovery reinforced his belief that something unusual had happened before the fire. He wondered whether moving the ladder had prevented him from reaching the upstairs windows in time. Others have suggested less dramatic explanations. It is possible the latter had been moved earlier and simply wasn't where George expected during the chaos of the emergency. Human memory during traumatic events can also become distorted, making it difficult to reconstruct every detail with complete accuracy. Even so, George never accepted that explanation. In his mind, the missing ladder became another unanswered question added to an already growing list of coincidences that seemed increasingly difficult to ignore. As months turned into years, reports began reaching the Sodder family from people who believed they had seen the missing children after the fire. One witness claimed to have seen several children matching their descriptions in the company of unfamiliar adults. Another reported serving breakfast to children who resembled members of the Sodder family at a roadside establishment shortly after Christmas. Other stories emerged from different states, each carrying just enough detail to capture George and Jennie's attention. Investigators followed some of these leads, but none produced conclusive proof. Eyewitness testimony can be sincere while still being mistaken. Memories fade, faces resemble one another, and over time, publicity surrounding a famous case can unintentionally influence what people believe they remember. Yet for parents unwilling to accept that their children had died, each reported sighting represented another possibility worth pursuing. Every new tip offered hope, even when it ultimately led nowhere. That emotional tension between hope and uncertainty would define the family's life for decades. Rather than allowing the case to fade from public memory, George made a decision that kept the mystery alive across America. Along a busy highway, he erected a massive billboard displaying photographs of the 5 missing children and offering a substantial cash reward for any information that could lead to answers. Thousands of motorists passed it every year. Newspapers across the country continued reporting new developments, and letters began arriving from people convinced they had information that investigators had missed. The billboard became more than a reward notice. It became a public declaration that George and Jennie refused to abandon the search, regardless of how much time had passed. For some, it symbolized extraordinary determination. For others, it reflected parents struggling to let go after unimaginable loss. Either way, the case remained alive in the national conversation long after most investigations of its era had been forgotten. Then many years later, just when it seemed every possible lead had been exhausted, something arrived that reignited the mystery all over again. It wasn't a witness walking into a police station. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't new forensic evidence uncovered from the ruins of the house. Instead, it was something far more unexpected. An envelope appeared in the mail. Inside was a single photograph. If the image was genuine, it had the potential to change everything George and Jennie believed about that Christmas Eve. But if it wasn't, it represented one final twist in a mystery that had already blurred the line between evidence, hope, and unanswered questions. More than 20 years had passed since the fire, but George and Jennie Sodder had never stopped searching. Every letter, every telephone call, every reported sighting was carefully documented. They had followed leads across state lines, spoken with investigators, hired private detectives, and refused to remove the photographs of their 5 missing children from public view. Then in 1968, another unexpected clue arrived. An envelope postmarked from Kentucky appeared in the family's mailbox. There was no return address. Inside was a single photograph of a young man in his 20s. Tucked beside it was a handwritten note claiming that the man in the picture was Louis Sodder, one of the 5 children believed to have died on Christmas Eve in 1945. The note contained only a few brief words and an unfamiliar signature, offering no explanation of who had sent it or why. For George and Jennie, opening that envelope felt as though time had stopped. After more than 2 decades of uncertainty, they believed they might finally be looking at the face of a son they had never stopped hoping to find. The family studied the photograph with extraordinary care. They compared it to older pictures of Louis as a child, looking for similarities in the eyes, the shape of the face, the ears, and other facial features. To George and Jennie, the resemblance seemed remarkable. Friends and relatives also offered opinions, with some believing the similarities were too striking to dismiss as coincidence. The mysterious note only strengthened their curiosity. Why would someone anonymously send such a photograph unless they knew something about the case? George became convinced that the image deserved serious investigation. He even consulted a handwriting expert to examine the writing on the back of the photograph, hoping it might reveal the identity of the sender or provide another lead worth pursuing. Yet despite every effort, the origin of the photograph was never conclusively established. Investigators could not verify who mailed it when the picture had actually been taken, or whether the young man depicted had any connection to the Sodder family at all. The photograph remains one of the most famous pieces of evidence associated with the case, but it has never been authenticated in a way that resolves the mystery. For believers, it represents hope preserved across decades. For skeptics, it illustrates how an unexplained image can take on enormous significance in a case already surrounded by uncertainty. As the years passed, three broad explanations emerged, each supported by certain pieces of evidence while facing important challenges of its own. The first, and still the official conclusion, is that the five children died in the fire. Authorities pointed to the rapid spread of the blaze, the collapse of the house, and the circumstances facing the family that night. From this perspective, the tragedy, though heartbreaking, was the result of a catastrophic house fire. Fire investigations during the 1940s were conducted with methods far different from those available today, and some experts have noted that intense structural fires can make recovery and identification extremely difficult, especially given the limitations of forensic science at the time. Supporters of this explanation argue that no verified evidence has ever demonstrated that the children survived beyond that night. At the same time, critics of the official conclusion point to lingering uncertainties surrounding the search of the fire scene, the conflicting reports that followed, and questions about whether the investigation was thorough enough by modern standards. While the official explanation remains the most widely accepted, those unresolved issues have prevented the debate from disappearing entirely. The second theory is the one George and Jennie believed for the rest of their lives, that the children were somehow removed from the house before or during the fire. Supporters of this possibility point to the reported damage to the telephone line, the missing ladder, the unusual encounters George later recalled before the fire, the witness reports claiming the children were seen afterward, and finally, the mysterious photograph that arrived decades later. Viewed together, these details create a narrative that some believe deserves continued attention. However, each individual claim also faces significant obstacles. None of the reported sightings resulted in verified identification. The anonymous photograph has never been authenticated. The earlier encounters reported by George were remembered after the tragedy and cannot be independently confirmed in every detail. No physical evidence has ever conclusively demonstrated that an abduction occurred, nor has any investigation identified individuals responsible for carrying out such a plan. The theory remains compelling to many because it attempts to connect several unanswered questions into a single explanation, but those connections have never been proven beyond reasonable doubt. A third explanation focuses less on the physical evidence and more on the profound psychological impact of unimaginable loss. According to this view, George and Jennie's refusal to accept the official conclusion was an understandable human response to overwhelming grief. Psychologists have long recognized that families facing sudden tragedy often continue searching for certainty when important questions remain unanswered. Every reported sighting, every anonymous letter, and every resemblance in a photograph can carry enormous emotional weight because hope itself becomes impossible to abandon. This perspective does not suggest that George and Jennie intentionally misled anyone. On the contrary, it recognizes them as devoted parents who genuinely believed they were following credible leads. Even so, this explanation also has limitations. It does not fully account for every disputed detail surrounding the investigation, nor does it answer why certain aspects of the case continue to generate discussion among researchers decades later. Like the other theories, it explains some pieces of the puzzle while leaving others unresolved. Perhaps that is why the Sodder case continues to fascinate people nearly 80 years after the fire. Every major theory answers certain questions while creating new ones. Every clue seems meaningful until another fact complicates the picture. Every apparent breakthrough eventually encounters a missing piece that prevents the mystery from being settled once and for all. Despite decades of investigations, books, documentaries, interviews, and independent research, no definitive proof has ever confirmed any theory beyond doubt. There has been no verified evidence establishing that the children survived, and there has been no discovery that has erased every question surrounding the official conclusion. What remains is a case suspended between evidence, memory, and hope. In the end, the story becomes about something far greater than a single photograph, a missing ladder, or an unexplained fire. It becomes the story of George and Jennie Sodder, two parents who refused to let uncertainty become the final chapter of their children's lives. Long after the headlines faded and public attention moved elsewhere, they continued searching, asking questions, and following every lead, no matter how small. Whether history ultimately supports their beliefs or the conclusions reached by investigators, one fact remains beyond dispute: they never stopped looking. And perhaps that unwavering determination is the reason this mystery still resonates today, reminding us that for some families, the search for answers can last a lifetime, even when those answers may never come. Most unsolved mysteries gradually disappear from public memory. Witnesses grow older, newspapers stop printing updates, investigators move on to newer cases, and eventually even the most puzzling stories become little more than forgotten headlines tucked away inside old archives. But the story of George and Jennie Sodder never followed that path. Decade after decade, long after the fire itself had faded from national attention, people continued asking the same question that first emerged on Christmas morning in 1945. What really happened to the five missing children? It is a question that has survived changing generations, advances in forensic science, countless documentaries, books, newspaper investigations, and thousands of conversations between people who have reached very different conclusions after examining exactly the same evidence. Few mysteries have endured for so long while remaining so emotionally personal. That is because this story has never been defined solely by the evidence left behind. It has always been defined by the people who refuse to stop asking questions. Whether the five children died in the fire that Christmas Eve or somehow escaped remains a question that no investigation has answered conclusively. The official findings continue to stand, and many investigators believe the tragedy was the devastating result of a rapidly spreading house fire combined with the limitations of emergency response and forensic investigation in rural America during the 1940s. At the same time, the questions raised by George and Jennie have never completely disappeared. The missing ladder, the damaged telephone line, the reported sightings, the anonymous photograph. Individually, each detail may have an explanation. Together, they have continued to spark debate among researchers and historians who revisit the case decades later. Some see a collection of unfortunate coincidences viewed through the understandable grief of parents who could not accept the loss of their children. Others believe the unanswered questions deserve more weight than they were originally given. The remarkable thing is not that people disagree. It is that, after all these years, reasonable people can still study the same case and arrive at different conclusions. Perhaps the greatest tragedy isn't only what happened during those terrifying hours on Christmas Eve. It may also be what happened afterward. George and Jennie never experienced the kind of closure that many grieving families eventually find. Instead, they lived with uncertainty. Every unfamiliar face carried the possibility that one of their children might still be alive. Every unexpected telephone call, every anonymous letter, every reported sighting, and every newspaper clipping represented another chance, however small, that the story was not yet over. George continued searching until the end of his life, refusing to abandon the hope that somewhere, somehow, the truth could still be uncovered. Jennie preserved the family home site and kept the memories of her children alive for decades, unwilling to let time erase the questions that had shaped the rest of her life. Whether history ultimately proves their beliefs correct or not, no one can question the depth of their love or the determination that carried them through years of uncertainty. That may be the real reason this case continues to captivate people nearly 80 years later. It isn't simply because of an unexplained photograph or a disputed investigation. It is because the mystery forces us to confront something deeply human. How do you move forward when certainty never comes? How do you grieve when hope refuses to disappear? At what point does accepting an official conclusion become easier than continuing to search for another answer? George and Jennie chose to keep searching, even when the odds became smaller with each passing year. Others would have made a different choice. Neither decision erases the pain of that Christmas morning. Today, the house is gone, many of the original witnesses have passed away, and the voices that once filled the Sodder home exist only in old photographs, fading newspaper stories, and the memories preserved by those who refuse to let the case be forgotten. Yet the questions remain remarkably alive. That is the enduring legacy of this mystery. It reminds us that history does not always provide clean endings, and that some cases exist in the difficult space between what can be proven and what can only be believed. Until evidence emerges that definitively confirms one explanation over another, the fate of the five missing Sodder children will remain one of America's most haunting unanswered questions. And perhaps that is why this story continues to resonate across generations, not because we know exactly what happened, but because after nearly 8 decades, we still don't. As we reach the end of this investigation, we're left with the same question that has challenged investigators, journalists, historians, and countless families who have followed this case for generations. After looking at every major piece of evidence, from the official investigation and the fire itself to the missing ladder, the damaged telephone line, the reported sightings, and the mysterious photograph, what do you believe happened that Christmas Eve in 1945? Did the official investigation ultimately reach the right conclusion, with the tragedy explained by the devastating fire and the limitations of forensic science at the time? Or do the unanswered questions leave room for another explanation that has yet to be proven? Whatever your perspective, one thing is certain. This case reminds us how difficult it can be to separate certainty from possibility when crucial questions remain unanswered. If you have your own thoughts after hearing all the evidence, we'd love to hear them. Share your opinion respectfully in the comments below and let us know which pieces of evidence you found most convincing and which questions you believe still deserve answers. Stories like the one of George and Jennie Sodder remind us that history isn't always divided into simple categories of solved and unsolved. Sometimes the evidence points in more than one direction, witnesses remember events differently, and time leaves us with questions that may never receive definitive answers. That's why these investigations continue to fascinate people decades later, not because they offer easy conclusions, but because they challenge us to think critically, weigh the evidence carefully, and appreciate how complex real life can be. If you enjoyed this documentary and appreciate balanced investigations that examine every major theory without jumping to conclusions, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another episode. We have many more real mysteries to explore, and our next investigation examines another extraordinary case that has divided investigators and the public for decades. Until then, thank you for watching, thank you for spending your time with us, and we'll see you in the next investigation.